I'm Ed Walker for Sherdog.com, and here's some quick notes about UFC 238. We're going to start with what's being called the people's main event, and that's Tony El Kukui Ferguson, who's going to be taking on Donald Cowboy Cerrone in what's going to be the third fight from the top. So historically, this is a fantastic fight. Historically, this is probably the best fight that you can put together on paper right now with the current UFC roster. And that's a very bold statement, and I stand behind it simply because the history books do support that statement. Tony Ferguson is on a win streak that has bested everyone else in the history of the ultra-competitive UFC lightweight division with 11 straight wins. That's fantastic. Donald Cerrone, for his part, has 23 wins under the UFC banner, and that is a record right there. So a win by either one of these guys, and we're going to see that record extend. Either record does extend. History does get pushed another notch, and that's definitely something to pay attention to. From a style perspective, it really can't get much better than this. Both of these guys are action fighters. They are all about going in there and fighting. And while they do it with intelligence, while they do come in with game plans, while they do have adequate preparations in dealing with different sorts of opponents, they still have this ability to just turn that switch off and just go in there and get down. And that's something fans always appreciate. That's something that everyone who does appreciate mixed martial arts enjoys from time to time. And these two guys have delivered in that aspect time and time again throughout their careers. Now, one thing that I think we need to keep in mind here too, I did say this was the people's main event, and that's kind of what the UFC has been billing it as in their commercials, as it's taken more prominent placement in the advertising above Henry Cejudo versus Marlon Moraes and Valentina Shevchenko and Jessica Ai. And for good reason. I mean, these are guys that are fan friendly. These are guys that people do love to watch. So I do understand it from that perspective. They will put butts in seats. They will sell pay-per-views. And Donald Cerrone and Tony Ferguson have main evented many times on their own right. So that's something to keep in mind. But with this only being a main event in spirit, that means that we're not going to see it as a 5-rounder. And while that may not affect a lot of other results in some fights, I think, for instance, the Aldo Volkanovski fight, if that was a 5-rounder, maybe it would have been different, but probably not. But this is something where you might be seeing a different fight now, because both of these guys are known to be very slow starters. Both of these guys they tend to kind of take that first round, sometimes the first round and a half, and just feel the other person out and just see what they have to offer, and then construct their game plan from there, or then just decide what avenue to go down. And that's something that we really could it could come to a clash here, because if both of these guys start slow, if it ends up being sort of a staring match for the first half, that's going to be very disappointing. And then I think back to the Cerrone versus Ben Henderson 3 fight, where that fight looked like it was just getting started as the third round ended. And that's something that is a distinct possibility here. But then you also got to think, these guys will probably be planning for the other one to start slow. So then it's going to be a matter of who starts the slowest or who capitalizes on that flaw first. And that's something that we really should be keeping an eye on here. As far as picking who I think is going to win, I'm honestly just not prepared to do that right now, but I'll go off of the X factors right now. I'll just list those. The X factors, the biggest one actually, is the elephant in the room, Tony Ferguson and his health. While he did have a serious knee injury that he miraculously rehabbed ahead of UFC 229, even though Pettis did affect that leg, I think in the first round, I think we saw Pettis target it, and it seemed to affect Ferguson's movement some. So maybe he re-aggravated something, I don't know. But primarily his mental health. And while this is a very touchy subject, it is something that we shouldn't be ignoring. Tony Ferguson just had a very high-profile sort of problems in the household with the claims that his wife made, and police reports filed and whatnot, and temporary restraining orders. And you just wonder, how good is he mentally right now? Is he in fact ready to jump in there and compete? And we certainly hope so. We certainly hope the best for Tony Ferguson, but I think that is something that we need to keep in mind as we're trying to handicap this fight. Donald Cerrone, his big X factor is the Dad Cerrone moniker, and that's something that he's been very good under that banner. That Dad Cerrone moniker has been great to him, and he's been out there on a rampage and just really doing it at an extremely high level. Very good stuff to watch. But he does tend to stay overactive and at some point run flat and put on a very uninspiring performance. The first thing that comes to mind is the Nate Diaz fight, where he went on a ridiculous run for that year, and then he ended the year with a very ho-hum performance that resulted in a pretty bad win at a bad time for him as far as his climb up the ladder of the lightweight division. So if we go 100% Ferguson and 100% Cerrone here, I'm leaning toward 100% Ferguson because we haven't seen 100% Ferguson really get beaten. Yes, he did drop a split decision to Michael Johnson, but, you know, we haven't seen somebody really go out there and work Tony Ferguson. And that was such a long time ago, and Tony Ferguson has improved so greatly as a fighter. In addition, he has the ability to put a lot of pressure on guys, and that seems to be the one thing that he always manages to break someone with, is the pressure, is that constant output, constantly in your face, constantly doing something and keeping you, your body, and your mind busy, which eventually breaks a lot of guys. We've seen that time and time again. I think the Kevin Lee fight is probably the best example of that, to endure such a bad first round and then to come back with such ferocity and just keep that pace going and take your opponent into deeper waters and then drown them. That is an ability that Ferguson has shown to be very adept at. So I do want to put Tony Ferguson as my tentative pick to win this fight. I'm not quite sure if that'll stand by the time I turn in staff picks, but that's my quick notes for UFC 238, Tony Ferguson versus Donald Cerrone.